Today, we are going to be reaching the midpoint of the book of Exodus. For the most part, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 20. That's out of the 40 chapters that are in the book. And it does also serve as essentially the centerpiece of the book of Exodus because this is going to be the 10 Commandments. That's what we're going to start looking at today. We'll do the first 4 commandments today and then look at the last 6 next week. And we're going to be focusing now on God's law. What it was that he wanted to give the Israelites as he was bringing them into a covenant relationship with him. What the nature of that relationship was going to be, was going to require from them, and what we still need to understand from this today as well. Recognizing what it means for God to be jealous of our worship, but also recognizing his mercy, that he loves us, and that we should also love him, that we need to learn to respect him, not to provoke him. And so while we will be in Exodus chapter 20 for the most part, we're actually going to set the stage with a little bit from Exodus chapter 19 first. If you have your Bibles and you want to open them up, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 19. And if you're using an electronic device, want to get onto the hotel's Wi-Fi, their login information is on the handouts that you have. But Exodus chapter 19 verse 1 says that in the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. For they had departed from Rephidim, had come to the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. And then all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I come to you in the thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and believe you forever. So Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. So we've reached the point where the Israelites are in the Sinai wilderness because God has brought them here for the purpose of forming a covenant, which from an ancient standpoint was essentially a treaty, that you would have a weaker leader and a stronger leader, and they would come together in order to agree that the weaker nation would send tribute, and they would obey, and they would do what was ever required by the greater power, and then the greater power would agree to protect them and would not attack them. And so that's what God wants to have with the Israelites, is this relationship where he will reign over them and they will serve him, and it's on the basis of what he's already done for them, how he has rescued them out of Egypt. He set them free. He's already shown that he values them and wants to have them as his treasure forever. Now, that's not as a result of anything really that's special about them. They're not worthy of this attention. They don't deserve it, but he has chosen them for that purpose, and he wants to use them in order to teach the world about himself. Because the whole world is his, they're going to be a nation of priests in order to inform the world about God and ultimately to sanctify the world, because it is through them that God is going to send his Redeemer for all of mankind, and that it's going to be through Israel that the Messiah enters the world. And so this is the choice that he presents to them. Will they be part of all of this? And they agree. And so with their agreement, the time has now come for God to lay out the actual terms of this covenant that they are going to have. And I think it's important with the 10 Commandments just to bear in mind, because sometimes, especially with the way that we see this portrayed, sometimes in movies and things, is that we think about Moses going up to Mount Sinai alone in order to receive the 10 Commandments and then bringing them back on the stone tablets. That is kind of telescoping things a little bit and putting them in an order that they're not actually in. And the 10 Commandments, God actually speaks them directly to the entire nation of Israel. They all hear him saying these things. So it's not quite yet that Moses has gone up alone. Everybody hears this, and so everybody hearing it knows that it's coming directly from God, and so that's going to show them that the rest of the law that they receive, that's not Moses making something up. That's what he's being given by the Lord. So just with that bit of context in mind, we can start with the first commandment that's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. So this starts out with God identifying himself, doing essentially what he did. It had been maybe a year or two previous that Moses had been in the same place and met God at the burning bush. And he had told Moses, I am who I am. I am Yahweh. That he is saying of himself, he's the only one who simply is. Has no source, has no cause, there's no power higher, greater than him. Which means that he's the source of everything else. He's the creator of the universe, and so therefore, again, the whole world is his. But he also identifies himself on the basis of his actions for Israel. So he's the God of everything by his nature, but he's their God especially because he set them free from slavery. That's what all of this depends upon. The love that he has shown is the reason why they should be devoted to him. And so if that's true of them, when they were freed from slavery, a temporal circumstance, then it's even more true of Christians. That God is especially our God because of what he's done for us, what he gave in Christ, and what we have that lasts forever, not just for a single lifetime. And so for us, as much as for the Israelites, we should have no other gods before God. This is, of course, the heart of the first commandment, is that there's not supposed to be any division of loyalties, anything that is set up against God, which is kind of more of a literal translation of the idea of having anything before God. He's not supposed to have any rivals. He doesn't actually have any, so we shouldn't treat him like he does. He should be the sole object of our worship. And Jesus talks about this as well. In Matthew chapter 6, he makes mention how we should not have anything that competes with God, that we can't try to serve two masters. That if we try to do that, ultimately we're just going to hate one while we're actually loving the other. And we don't want to be serving God, and mammon is what he says there. And mammon is the name of a false god, but he's also using that just to connote the idea of gain, avarice, greed. That if you're pursuing material wealth and at the cost of everything else, then that's worshiping something other than God. And so it's not just the idea of idols that are present in this, but they are very much part of this. And that's what we see in the second commandment. That starts in verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And what we want to understand here is this is not God condemning art. This is not saying that any type of visual representation that we make is sinful. It is, again, talking specifically about idols. Anything that we could craft in order to have an image of and then to give our worship to. So this ties directly into the first commandment, just understanding that there is nothing above God that is worthy of worship, nothing greater than him. There's also nothing beside God. Sometimes we can have this false idea of Satan being essentially God's equal opposite, and that the light and the darkness are equal to one another and they're at war with one another and it's an open competition. That's not the case at all. Satan is just another creature and he is weaker than God. And so we don't have to fear or respect or be concerned about him to the same extent that we are the Lord. And then, of course, also there's nothing beneath God that is worthy of worship. Everything is beneath him. It's all his. But it's not like the pantheons of the world's other religious systems. And that, of course, that word is Greek, and it's the Greek pantheon we're most familiar with, usually in our culture, that you have Zeus, who was the greatest of the Greek gods, but then you had others too, Hera and Ares and Hephaestus and all these other different gods that they also worshipped. We are not to do anything of that sort. That was not why humanity was created. in order to worship anything along with God. Devotion belongs to Him alone. And so therefore that means it's not just idols that are really being referred to here. False gods by name, according to the old pagan systems, it's anything that we set up as an idol in our hearts and devote ourselves to that takes us away from what we actually owe to God. People who are more concerned about their careers or their houses and their cars or their children even, as important as children are, that they are not the first commitment. God is. And that we have to understand that and give Him what He is actually due. So that is present in the second commandment, but there's also more to it because this is God not only saying not to make idols of anything else, it's also saying not to make any idols of Him. Not to try to put Him in some type of form, because that's impossible. He's invisible, and He's ineffable. That means He cannot be described by anything that we have. There's no part of nature that can capture Him, which was the idea of an idol for the ancients, is that you would have some type of form of wood or stone or metal, and then the nature of the god, its essence, would become part of that idol, and it therefore would be held by that idol. And so any attention that was paid to that idol would have to be paid attention to by that god, and they would have to accept whatever offerings were given to it and essentially be commanded to do whatever the worshiper wanted. God, the one true God, does not work that way. All of creation is His. None of it can tie Him down. None of it can buy Him off. And to attempt to do that would have been a violation of this command for the Israelites, and again, as much for us. That if we try to fit God into the box of our own understanding and desire, and how I always say, God is not our genie, that's what we sometimes try to do, is to force Him to respond to the conception of what we want Him to be, rather than how He describes Himself. Which, of course, is the exception. God has been described by things that are of this world, but through His condescension. He speaks down to us. That's literally the case in this passage. God is using human language, which cannot hope to actually fully describe Him, but He's using it in order to say something about Himself. And the most important form of condescension that He ever undertook was to actually come down and be one of us. Humanity cannot contain who God is, cannot describe who God is. But God chose to be a human being, to live our life, to die in our place, to rise again so that we could live and actually be with Him forever, which we cannot hope to do on our own. He chose those things. We cannot force anything of that sort on Him. And then along with this idea of idolatry, the Lord here says a few very challenging things, very difficult things to understand. First of all, by talking about His jealousy. And what does that mean? Because we think of jealousy as a bad thing. How can God be jealous? Well, first of all, understanding that this is an example of the condescension that I'm talking about. God talking down to us. Because He's using something that is emotionally understandable. It doesn't perfectly describe Him, but it says something that we can actually figure out. And a husband who had an unfaithful wife would have every right to be jealous. And God is drawing the comparison that He is the husband to Israel in this relationship, and that He desires faithfulness from them. And we need to understand, too, that jealousy is not intrinsically wrong. It's not always wrong in every case in and of itself. It's wrong if it's irrational. It's wrong if it's jealousy when there's no reason to be jealous. It's also wrong when it's not really jealousy, when it's envy, when it's the desire for something that we actually don't have any right to. That's wrong also. But when it's something that you have an actual right to and someone's trying to take it away, then being jealous of it, wanting to protect it, is right. God alone has the right to be worshipped. And so, of course, He has every right to be jealous when we try to give worship to anything else. So that's the idea of God's jealousy. Even more difficult than that is what He says after. The idea of punishing generations, children, for the sins of their fathers. And that sounds terrible to us. It doesn't sound very fair. It wouldn't be if we were supposed to understand it that way. And God actually does say elsewhere that that's not directly how it works. Places like Deuteronomy chapter 24 and Ezekiel chapter 18, he speaks about how every individual is responsible for their own sin. But what he's talking about here is what societies have the potential to do, and all with a propensity, really, to do, is to inculcate sin, to pass it on, to teach each rising generation that something evil is actually good. We have examples to hand. We just had a month where pride was taught as something to be celebrated, and sexual sin to go along with it. And that this is being taught to children as though it is valuable. And what God is saying here is that everyone is going to be accountable for what they choose to take from their parents, from those who have preceded them. That there's going to be a cost involved for them, that this is really about God's justice. Not that he's punishing innocent people for what the guilty have done, but that everyone is going to be accountable. They're not going to have an excuse for saying, well, that was what my culture taught me. You still know that it's wrong. And so there's still a danger involved in it for invoking God's jealousy and for putting something ahead of him. But what's even more important than that is his mercy. That for those who follow God instead, who recognize that what society has taught them is ultimately not good, and they instead turn to him, they receive grace from him. They receive forgiveness because they still need it. They're not perfect. They require what God gives, but if they actually ask for it, they get it. They experience his love. And then they have the potential of passing it on, of being able to teach others that this is what is truly required, this is better than what the world offers, and that it lasts forever, far outstripping that anger that lasts for a few generations. So this ultimately is not a statement of God being unfair, or actually I guess you could say it is, because he's more merciful than we really deserve. So with that, we can then move on to the third commandment. It starts in verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. This brings us again to the idea of the Lord's name, how important it is. Because for anyone, a name is synonymous with a person. They're just attached to one another. And so the Lord's name, Yahweh, I am, is synonymous with his sovereignty and with his sanctity, with who he is. And so to use that name inappropriately is to offend him, is to disrespect him. Now, for the Israelites, what this would have mostly had to do with was the swearing of oaths. That would have been kind of what was primarily in mind, because that was what the ancient peoples did, is that they would, if you had an Egyptian, they would maybe say, I swear to you by Osiris that I'll return your ox a fortnight, I don't know, something like that. That's how they would make their promises, and then they wouldn't intend to keep them half the time. And so God was telling the Israelites, don't you do that. If you bring my name into it, I am actually going to be paying attention. You better keep your word. I'm going to hold you accountable because you don't just throw that around. But of course, that does mean it also includes the idea of swearing, simply. Far more common in our culture to use the Lord's name as an expletive. And that is flippancy. It's using his name without respecting who he is. And so it also falls under something that we should not do. But there is a third meaning that's present here as well, that's also valuable, especially valuable within the church, is that it is using the Lord's name in vain to act in his name, but against his will. That the most famous historical example of that is the Crusades. That's the one most people would think of, is the people who went out and fought wars and killed for Christ, when the New Testament does not ask us to do anything of the sort. That's not what he would desire. But we do this on a regular basis, oftentimes with just the way that the church is looked at by those who are not Christians. Is that we will say we are Christians, but then we will do things that are not very Christ-like. And we will do so in ways that will point out that we don't actually care to even try. And that we're more interested in holding other people accountable than holding ourselves accountable. When we do that, we alienate them. We use God's name, but actually drive people away from him. That is not what he wants. And that's another form of using his name in vain. Something that we should still, even though this is the Old Testament law, the Ten Commandments, we shouldn't want to do that either. And then finally, for today, the fourth commandment, Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, made it holy. The Sabbath, the Israelites are told here, is to be remembered, in other words, observed. That they're supposed to have this day and set it aside every single week. And the purpose of it is so that they will rest. Because people do have to be taught to do that. That you cannot constantly be busy, constantly be working. So they have to set it aside sometimes and just trust God to be in control. And they are all supposed to do that. Because the urge, of course, would have been to say, well, okay, that command's for me because I'm important enough for it. But my kids, they still need to do what I want them to do. Or my servants, they're still going to work. Or that guy's a foreigner. He's not even part of what we're doing here. So yeah, he's still got to... God says, no. Everyone needs to stop. Because this is about giving everyone an equal opportunity to rest. But more than that, it's about God. That this day of the week was for sacred service. Not just to do nothing, but to worship. And it follows God's model. It's meant to reflect creation. How God worked for 6 days in order to make everything, and then he knew when he was done. He was just able to stop. He didn't have to find new things to do. He just finished. We have to be able to do the same thing. So we learn something from him by looking back on that. But then the Israelites also, if they thought of that, really thought of that every week, well, then they're going to be recalling God's power. How he made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything that is in them. What that says about him. Why, again, that says that he is worthy of worship. And also how he is worthy of worship because this great God who watches over everything cared enough about them to set them free. Now, we talked about this last week some, that this has changed in the Christian era. We don't have a ritual obligation to keep the Sabbath day. And most of us don't. We don't generally worship on Saturdays at all. The New Testament doesn't say anything one way or the other. You can have church on Saturdays. It doesn't really make a difference. We do that on Sundays because that was the day of the week that Jesus rose from the tomb. And so it kind of makes sense to make that our day of worship. But there's no rule that is in place, no law to follow. And we don't have to keep it the way that the Israelites did, but there's still an idea here. There's still a principle that should matter to us. To be able to, it's cliche, but there's truth to it, let go and let God. That there's some truth to that. That we have to be able to trust him rather than thinking that everything depends upon us. And so if we'll put our work and our need to be busy, busy, busy all the time, if we can set that aside and just trust in God, then that's going to have value to us. And we should also, of course, take that time for devotion. To not just be wasting it and doing nothing, but actually focusing on God and who he is, the love that he has shown, the love that we should return to him. And also, while we do that, that we should be respecting the needs that others have too. The rest that we have been given is rest that we should want to share. So that makes the fourth commandment kind of interesting, actually, because it's a bit of a segue. The first four commandments really focus on our relationship with God. The following six have more to do with the relationships that people have between one another. But this element of respect kind of ties the two ideas together, that we're supposed to care about our relationship with God and with other human beings. But it still does mostly depend upon God. That day, that concept of rest was for him. As all four of these were, because they flow from what Jesus would eventually call the greatest commandment. In Matthew chapter 22, he's actually quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6, but Matthew 22 verses 37 and 38. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. That idea is what these four laws come from, is that we should love God. And loving God means worshiping him, and only worshiping him. And loving God means not setting up other false idols in our lives that we devote ourselves to and lead him to jealousy. And loving God means respecting him enough to use his name properly and to do what reflects well on him. And loving God means trusting him to be in control rather than us having to have our hands on everything in our lives. That's what this all comes down to, is devotion, respect, love for God, for who he is and for what he has done for us. And so for anyone who has never made that decision to actually love God that way, the way that he calls for, it's what we invite you to do here at the Potter's Church. And to understand that if you haven't, and maybe this sounds a little bit shocking, and it's a little bit intended to, but if you're not doing them, then that means that you're hating God. And it's just really in a literal sense, because that's what he does say here, the concern, the punishments for those generations that hate him. If God calls for worship and he's worthy of it, and that's what it means to love him, then to not do that is the opposite. It is to hate him. And that's not good. But don't get caught up in that negativity. Instead, look at what's being extended, the love that he has for you, that he has made available in Christ by coming down to be one of us, to give his life for you. That is what he has made available. So respond to that and love him back by accepting his mercy instead of his anger, and finding forgiveness and life that will last forever. I hope that anyone who needs to make that decision will be able to do so today, recognizing the importance of this. But for those of us who have, for Christians, we have to live out of this. We do understand that the situation has changed. Israel looked at these laws as something that they were obligated to obey. What we eventually discovered is that it was impossible to obey. We could never live up to everything that God requires because we cannot be as holy, as perfect as he is. And so we required his holiness on our behalf, and that was what he gave us in Christ. So we don't do these things out of obligation, but we should adhere to these principles out of gratitude, to thank the Lord for what he has done. So live for him. Those idols, those things that you put up or keep putting back up, just put them away again. Ask for forgiveness. Come back to God. Live to respect his name and to see others glorify it. Rest in him, in what you have that only he can provide. And lead others to that rest, to that peace of God that passes understanding. Remember why he is your God, who he is, and what he has done to set you free, and use that freedom to glorify his name.